Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is the third of 5 lectures on Plato's dialogue, The Republic. Today, we'll be covering books 2 to 4, where Socrates and his interlocutors build and construct the proper city in speech and relate that to the proper ordering of the soul. So let's get started. So at the beginning of book 2, we have a new beginning. Socrates had thought that the discussion was over and it was the end of the argument, but Glaucon jumps in and forces the discussion to return to a new beginning. He begins this return by insisting that Socrates restate the view of justice. He does so by taking up and elaborating the common sense view of justice, the view held by Thrasymachus, but makes it more profound. Glaucon says in doing so, he takes on the role of an actor. He's just reciting myths he doesn't believe. And he reformulates the question of justice in relation to the question of the good. In book 1, you'll recall the question was raised in relation to art or skill. And we'll see as the dialogue progresses that the artisan, someone who practices their skills, is the lowest of the citizens within the city. So the good transcends the city. And here's a quote from Glaucon making his case. They say that doing injustice is naturally good and suffering injustice bad, but that the bad in suffering injustice far exceeds the good in doing it, so that when they do injustice to one another and suffer it and taste of both, it seems profitable to those who are not able to escape the one and choose the other, to set down a compact among themselves, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. I'll just stop there for a second. It's interesting here how way back in one of the earliest works of political philosophy, we see in kind of kernel form already insights that would be taken as novel insights later by Hobbes and Locke, that perhaps the community comes from a compact of individuals trying to get together and avoid injustice from other members. So I'll continue with the quote. And from there they began to set down their own laws and compacts and to name what the law commands lawful and just. And this then is the genesis and being of justice. It is a mean between what is best, doing injustice without paying the penalty, and what is worse, suffering injustice without being able to avenge oneself. The just is the middle between these two, cared for not because it is good, but because it is honored due to a want of vigor in doing injustice. The man who is able to do it and is truly a man would never set down a compact with anyone not to do injustice and not to suffer it. He'd be mad. Now the nature of justice is this and of this sort, and it naturally grows out of these two sorts of things. So the argument goes. So Glaucon defines justice as respect for legally established equality, which supersedes natural inequality. So justice is the advantage of the weaker by nature who become stronger by law. For Thrasymachus, justice is also the advantage of the stronger by law, legal positivism, but he had not thought of what would be justice in accordance with nature. Glaucon illustrates this problem through the myth of the ring of Gyges, and we should note the similarity of this ring of Gyges with the cap of invisibility of Hades. So the myth of the ring of Gyges, the wearer is invisible and able to get away with all sorts of injustices. And so according to the story, anyone with this sort of power, if they were to escape any sort of recompense or consequences for their actions, would go ahead and seek advantages through this sort of power of invisibility. So Glaucon points to the conflict between the individual and the common good. And we should note, for instance, Thomas Hobbes, I mentioned quickly earlier, the connection between the Glaucon's restatement and Hobbes. There's slight differences, though. On Hobbes' point of departure is that there's a natural equality. And with that natural equality, says that individuals cannot pursue the good life in isolation. So he cannot overcome evil threatening him in the absence of society. Glaucon says there's a natural inequality, and he points to the best life is the tyrannical life. If you can get away with it, if you're powerful enough, strong enough, tyrannical enough to get away with it, and maybe you can conceal these things, this is the best course of action. Socrates will have to overcome this version of the unjust speech. If we recall Aristophanes, the clouds, he'll have to point to a different understanding of natural equality, and he will have to define the good life as philosophy. It's also, let's say, the life of an individual who's able to escape natural, or let's say political compacts of others, and have a sort of advantageous life alone, but it will not take the tyrannical form. Adimantus restates the case and says, it kind of builds on what Glaucon's saying, but it's interesting, Adimantus's point of departure. He stresses that justice is, in the common view, is intrinsically bad, and it's only good for the rewards received. It's difficult to pursue and by nature bad for one to pursue. So Adimantus demands a defense of justice that shows that it's easy. So if we were to look at both of these together, again, we've got Socrates with these two main interlocutors in this main point, and pretty much for the rest of the dialogue as a whole. So before he had as interlocutors first Cephalus, then Polemarchus and Thrasymachus. Now he has, from books 2 onwards, Glaucon and Adimantus. Glaucon requests a definition of justice, a defense of justice that satisfies natural inequality of superior individuals, and this justice would be marked by their competitive overcoming of others. And it is then a certain movement. It is marked by a certain spiritedness, we'll call it, and we'll come to see it later in this section, where Socrates defines these three parts of the soul, and the part of the soul that is most aligned to Glaucon, and as we'll see, the part of soul that is the strongest with the guardians is this thumotic aspect, the thumos, a certain spiritedness and a seeking of honor, these types of things that mark the warrior, that mark someone who's willing to sacrifice one's own life for something beyond that. So this is the type of justice that would be needed to satisfy Glaucon. Adimantus aligns justice with ease or repose. So justice is a form of moderation and would be aligned with that part of soul, sophrosyne, sophrosyne is moderation, but that part of soul that needs to be moderated, Eros, and his critique of justice is also a critique of poetry, whereas Glaucon had used the language of poetry and myth. So Socrates will need to weave these two senses together. We can only assume that justice, as assigning to each individual their due and procuring the common good, are compatible if we assume there's an essential similarity between the city and the individual. So Socrates will proceed by examining the question of justice writ large in the city, and then he will say, okay, then let's be able to find it writ small in the individual. So that conjunction of the city and the individual is also, and the need to see justice writ large versus writ small is also aligned to the notion that justice has to somehow get to this tension between what is good for the community and what's good for the individual. They don't always align. So Socrates is going to come to a definition of justice in the city by means of constructing a city in speech. So this is what becomes, and we had occasion to talk about this in the first lecture. Often the Republic is seen as this depiction of an ideal city, that type of thing. It is a construction of a city in speech. The question of whether or not it's to be seen as an ideal city is more complicated. There's a certain amount of irony throughout. So Socrates says, if we should watch a city coming into being in speech, I said, would we also see its justice coming into being and its injustice? So it's a city in speech coming into being, and for this reason, we're able to see what is justice and injustice. So at this point, the question of Socrates' method could be raised. Why does he follow Glaucon in attempting to see the nature of justice in terms of its coming into being? In all other dialogues, a virtue is examined by examining it in terms of what is X, what is justice, what is courage, etc. So the idea is pursued through this what is question. So this could be, this difference in method could be part of the overall dialogue's, let's say, goal, Socrates' goal in the dialogue as a whole, to appeal to Glaucon's nature. Perhaps another way of thinking about it would be the city belongs to the realm of becoming, of change, and does not have an idea. So Aristotle says that Plato posited ideas only of natural things, and perhaps the city is not natural. But if there's a strict parallel of city and individual, it would have to be natural. So we don't have a good answer to that question. We'll see that in this construction of the city in speech, there's three stages. So there'll be the city of artisans as the first stage he describes that complies with Adimantus's character. There's the city of what we could call the armed camp, where we have the guardians instituted, and this would comply with Glaucon's thumotic notion of justice. And then finally, there's this cured city, and we have what's described later on, the city of the ruled by the philosopher. And we should ask ourselves if the philosopher's city is another form of justice that would somehow be more compatible with Socrates' way of life. And would this form of justice be compatible with the way of life of the other two orders of men represented by Adimantus and Glaucon? So beginning with the city of artisans, Socrates describes a simple city, a very small, basically a small village where natural needs are met and supplied by the various arts and skills of individual members. So the city is autarkic or self-contained and self-sufficient. The justice that's displayed in the city of artisans cannot be a virtue since it requires no toil or struggle. And Glaucon jumps in and calls this a city of pigs since there's only basic needs of existence are provided and there's no higher striving. So Socrates then goes on to describe what we would need, what would be needed in this city to satisfy higher needs, and maybe they would need to have different types of goods, and they would have to form an army, take over other territories. And this healthy city then is replaced by a feverish city of sorts, because maybe they would have more desires for different products. In this feverish city, justice is not natural, it must be instituted. And Socrates and Glaucon are described as founders of this city, whereas the healthy city, first city, had been described as developing naturally. So the feverish city is purged and its desires moderated through the institutions and the educational regime that will be described in the rest of books 2 to 4. And the feverish city requires the founding of the art of war. The previous city didn't require the kind of exchange and relations to the outside, and now they will need to be able to protect their luxuries. They'll have to go and conquer territory. And the institution of the warrior's art means that there's now a hierarchy of arts. There's the warrior art, which is more important, and then there are these other arts. In the first city, all the arts were on even terms as money making, and it was the universal art. Every artisan practiced their art and then would make money. The warrior has a different type of art. The warrior's art goes beyond economic calculation. The guardian soldiers are not just another type of job, it's a new class and it points to a new part of the soul. Other arts have their roots in the satisfaction of desires or the will to survive, whereas the military art has its roots in spiritedness. The warrior spirit cannot be reduced to economic calculation. So the willingness of a warrior to risk one's life cannot be defined in these terms of an art that is there to advance the will to survive. It goes beyond the will to near existence. It satisfies a higher need to let us say, protect the city, protect one's own. So Socrates asks what kind of nature is suited to fill this role and says that they will be like a noble dog filled with courageous spirit, Thumos, and they'll need to be gentle with their own and ferocious against enemies. So they'll love their own and hate the enemy. And remember early on with Paul Marcus, we had discussed how justice was seen there as giving goods to friends and harm to enemies. We should note just in passing that Plato's Republic in this sense seems to have influenced Carl Schmitt's famous and provocative idea that the essence of the political lies in the distinction between the friend and the enemy. And he lays this out in his work, The Concept of the Political, in 1932. And Carl Schmitt's a very controversial figure, a legal theorist, part of the Nazi Party in the 30s. And the political is defined by Schmitt by the existential distinction between friend and enemy. It's not a moral or economic distinction, it's existential. And Schmitt critiques Enlightenment rationalism and liberal universalism, which he sees as denying this reality of political conflict. Back to Plato, Socrates next describes the educational system that's going to produce these guardians that are so essential for that city of the armed camp. And this education is divided between musical education for the soul and gymnastic education for the body. Socrates begins with musical education, broadly speaking. And by musical education, he means anything to do with the muses. So oratory, poetry, rhythm. So a broad category of what we would just normally think of as education broadly. And he begins with the stories that are told to the young, mainly by means of the poets. Socrates is going to correct or rewrite these stories that the poets currently tell so that they're formative of good character. He'll first correct the poets' portrayal of the gods in Book 2, and then he'll correct their portrayal of heroes in Book 3. Plato has Socrates critique traditional representations of the gods. So traditional representations of the gods are that they're many, that they change form, they change shape, they're sometimes bad, they lie, they're deceitful. So all Greek myths, people can think of these things. Zeus taking on the shape of different animals to seduce and otherwise play nasty tricks on humans. And these don't seem to be depictions of the gods that are ennobling either of human character and they doesn't seem to accord with the philosophic view what would be the highest things. And we should note here that this critique of the poet's depiction of the gods is really picking up on earlier, the first pre-Socratic philosophers who had already pointed out some of these things, such as notably Xenophanes. And I'll put a link in the description to my lecture on the quarrel of philosophy and poetry that goes into that in a bit more detail. So the Platonic image of the gods is to replace these attributes with the following more philosophically appealing attributes. So God is one, not many, and is unchanging. He is good only. He is truthful always. And this this new representation of the God is not in accord with earlier discussions of justice. In those discussions, justice, it was noted, sometimes requires that people lie. So the discussion of justice that we're already on took as its point of departure, let us say, in a human dealings in the political realm, a certain notion of what is just. And when talking about the things that transcend the political dimension, Socrates, Plato point to things that transcend and go beyond those definitions of justice. The need to be justice in the political realm means sometimes lying. In the highest things within the cosmos as a whole, within beings as a whole, it's truth as such. We should note that the gods, as so represented, are critically removed from the realm of human becoming. The gods are being as such. They're self-sufficient, whereas humans have been described as essentially lacking. It's the essential lack that directs humans toward the city and to communal life so that others can, if only provisionally, supply that lack. Humans are erotic. The gods are unerotic. So there is a question of the difference between philia and eros here. The guardians care for the city out of a certain love of one's own, philia, not a love of what is other or beyond oneself, eros. It is the third class, the money-making class, that is erotic in that sense. And we'll see that in books 5 to 7, the philosophers are defined by their erotic nature, but their erotic nature in the highest sense, not seeking things beyond them that are goods, so to speak, or money, but seeking the highest things that are beyond them. So we can turn to this quote now that talks about the representation of Hades in the poets. So Socrates says, then concerning these tales too, it seems we must supervise those who undertake to tell them and ask them not simply to disparage Hades' domain in this way, but rather to praise it, because what they say is neither true nor beneficial for men who are to be fighters. And just to remind you of the context here, he's saying that if we want to produce guardians who are soldiers who are not afraid to risk their lives in fighting, we must depict the afterlife, the underworld that they are at risk of entering, not as this horrible realm. We need to show this as something beneficial. And I'll continue with the quote. Indeed, we must, he said. Then we'll expurge all such things, I said, beginning with this verse. Quote, I would rather be on the soil a serf to another, to a man without lot, whose means of life are not great, than rule over all the dead who have perished. This is Achilles from the Odyssey. So the context is the Odyssey. Odysseus has descended into the underworld. He encounters the ghost of Achilles, and Odysseus begins praising him and said, "Oh, it must be great to be you. You're the greatest hero, and your fame continues to be spoken of in the realm of the living." And Achilles is saying, "Well, I'd rather be the lowest serf, and toil in the realm of the living, in the upper world, so to speak, than be the king of the underworld." So Socrates is saying we can't have that. We can't have those lines because it doesn't depict the underworld as something that a hero would risk entering as long as his fame and his honor lives on. And that's very much the Iliadic, the Achilles ideal of the Iliad. We should note, however, and I make this point up here in the top right, that this is ironic because this exact quote is brought back in a positive light to describe the nature of life in the cave. That is, in book 7, when they're describing the allegory of the cave that we'll get to in the next lecture, philosophers would rather be in the land of truth, out beyond the cave, than rule this land of the cave, which is an underworld. So in that context, Socrates brings back this quote and says, wouldn't philosophers feel like Achilles, that they would rather be toil on the soil, a serf to another in the realm of truth, so to speak, than to rule over all those within the cave. Now, we'll go to another quote here where we're talking about Socrates is making a distinction between types of presentation in poetry, between diegesis in Greek and mimesis. So diegesis is narrative. So if we're putting forth something through a narrator who presents a character, presents an action, and then says, he said this, and then puts in quotes, that's narration. Mimesis, like a drama, has no narrative mediation. It just is the presentation of each character's speeches. So Socrates says, in my opinion, I said, when the sensible man comes in his narrative to some speech or deed of a good man, he will be willing to report it as though he himself were the man and won't be ashamed of such an imitation. He will imitate the good man most when he is acting steadily and prudently, less and less willingly when he's unsteadied by diseases, loves, drink, or some other misfortune. But when he meets with someone unworthy of himself, he won't be willing seriously to represent himself as an inferior, unless, of course, it's brief, when the man does something good. Rather, he'll be ashamed, both because he's unpracticed at imitating such men and because he can't stand forming himself according to and fitting himself into the models of worse men. In his mind, he despises this unless it's done in play. So I think the irony, again, I'm pointing to the irony on the top right, is Plato's own dialogues have to imitate the speeches of all sorts of characters, and he does not opt for an epic narration that only presents the speeches of heroes. Even in epic narration, we get Thersites in the Iliad. So with this description of education complete, Socrates can say that the city has now been purged. He then goes on to describe the consequences of this education in the institutions of the medical and judicial arts. And this can be best summarized with, I think, with the following parallels in this table. So we have, in terms of education, we have education of the body and the soul through gymnastic and music, and we've mentioned that. When it comes to the healing arts of each, when it comes to the body, we have a healing medical art. When it comes to the soul, we have the judicial art. If things are getting out of whack, we need our judges. We need that sort of judicial corrective. In terms of the proper order that is being sought, when it comes to the body, its health is a state of the proper ordering of the body. When it comes to the soul, that proper ordering is justice. And when it comes to the dialogue itself, the dialogue structure that we're in, the body seems to mirror the ergon, the deed, action of the dialogue, and the soul is the argument or speech. So let's turn now to the noble lie. So Socrates says we're going to be able to institute this if we have a noble lie that almost everyone believes. And the philia of the community, the love of one's own, will be shored up by this myth, a noble lie. Remember again that we have lying is essential to the political community in some way. The myth begins with asserting a certain natural equality. So the citizens are to be told that the education they received up until now is a dream. In fact, they have been formed under the earth, along with the tools of their trade. All citizens are brothers and sisters of the earth, which fosters a unity and justifies attachment to a particular land. We are, in a sense, indigenous to this land. Because they're formed with their particular tools of their trade, it justifies the fact that some will have to take on bad jobs. And we should note with this part of the noble lie, this parallel to the allegory of the cave, because all of our education up until now has been a fiction. We are in fact under the earth. The second part of the myth qualifies this natural equality by introducing hierarchical class structure. So we're all born under the earth, but we're born with one of three metals, which correspond to the class in which we find ourselves. So each person is said to have a soul composed of either gold if they're rulers, silver if they're guardians, the warrior class, or bronze, iron if they're the money-making artisans. These metals symbolize our natural attitude, so it's not an inherited status. And so this myth legitimizes the tripartite class structure. So if we have this perfectly just regime, which accords with a rational articulation of the best way for humans to live together in a community, why is there a need for this myth? The political realm, again, seems to require lies as part of its essential composition. And given that, there's a natural tension between the way of life of philosophy, which is truth-seeking, and the political realm, which it requires. And we're going to have to keep this in mind for our next lecture, where we look at the central books of the Republic, books 5 to 7, and the notion of the philosopher ruler, and whether or not that's desirable or possible, given this tension of the way of life of philosophy and the political realm. And at this point, we've not yet seen justice in itself, only the state in terms of its prevention of injustice. In this sense, it still corresponds with Glaucon's unjust speech. We now have the following order. The rulers are the shepherd, the warriors, the sheepdog, the laborers, the sheep. But where are the owners, the ultimate benefit of or good of the whole enterprise? We can perhaps surmise that the philosophers that we're going to talk about in books 5 to 7 will be to some extent seen as the goal, the product at which all of this aims. And this is very much a Nietzschean notion that the state is this clamp that nature puts on society in order to produce one or two great geniuses. To some extent, it's the philosophers who act as the owners, as they'll have the knowledge of the ends to which the individual activities of the city are directed, and that's more clearly described in book 10. So if I were to summarize in this schematic form, what we have at the end of this, towards the end of book 4, when we're saying, okay, we see justice in the city as the rulers doing their job, being guided by wisdom, guardians being guided by courage, money makers doing their job and moderating their desires, and justice is the proper order of each class performing its role. And then it's the same with respect to the parts of soul. We have 3 parts of soul. There are slightly different words used sometimes for this, but we have a rational part of soul, essentially logos. We have a spirited part of soul, which we've talked about, this thumos, that goes beyond, let's say, satisfying material desires, seeking honor, seeking risking one's own in order to protect a family, community. And then we have Eros, desire, satisfying those types of essential needs and wants. Now, when we think about these virtues, wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, we need to think about the distinction between virtue and values. Today we talk in the language of values. Will say, what are this organization's values? Do you adhere to this organization's values? Or you often hear parents say, I want to instill my values my children and ensure that they have those values. Now, values today, anyone can tell, are relative to a time and a place or a person. In some, like we're saying, these are my values, or this organization's values. They're always relative. They're not pointing to the fact that these are essential, natural, or true, whereas virtues in the classical world are all of those things. It's not as though being wise, courageous, moderate, or just, that these were just values that someone may or may not adhere to. These are enduring, timeless, genuine things according to nature that someone should try to live up and adhere to as much as possible. So if I were to summarize the structural parallels through many of the things we've been talking about so far, we talked about how there's in the three interlocutors in book one, Thrasymachus, Polemarchus, and Cephalus, seem to kind of map onto the interlocutors of the rest of the book, Socrates, Glaucon, and Adimantus. In the shepherd analogy, we have shepherd, sheepdog, and sheep that kind of map on there. We have the three metals in the noble lie, which map onto the three classes, rulers, guardians, and moneymakers, the parts of soul, reason, spirit, desire, as well as these virtues that we just described. So there seem to be these structural parallels throughout those books 2 to 4. I want to signal too how there's this abstraction from Eros, and this is a point that Strauss and Bloom make, Alan Bloom in his interpretive essay to his translation of the Republic, building very much on Leo Strauss, he admits himself. So this abstraction from the body or Eros is an essential aspect of the Republic, and points to how the Sidian speech that's defined there points to its limits, how it has to forget the body and marginalize Eros to get where we land there. It needs to be held in check for the city to come into its own. The Republic begins with a curse on Eros from Cephalus. In the discussion of the fundamental needs of humans, Socrates is silent on the need for procreation. Communism is limited to the upper classes. What is preeminently private is the body. So the most complete communism must leave the body out of the account. One's own becomes what's one's own art or skill, again, as opposed to one's own body. In the course of the dialogue, we'll see what is private, the body, is surpassed by what is truly common, the mind. Okay, so the communism of things is this political shadow of what the real communism in the real state, the real Sidian speech that we should aspire to in books 5 to 7, what is common are the ideas or the common questions throughout time that the philosopher looks at. So in this way, the city as presented in the Republic points to the true community, what Nietzsche calls the Republic of geniuses who share a reflection on essential truths. So we get this definition of justice early, book 4. So why do we need the rest of the dialogue? Well, he did say, let's look at justice and injustice. So that was what he was going to do. He was going to proceed to talk about the decay of cities into injustice. And the other point is that what we have is the political view of justice. And we're going to see in books 5 to 7, this transpolitical or philosophic view of justice. To see justice pure and simple, we need to turn to the highest individual, and the just man, the divine individual as such, is this philosophic individual. And we have to, in order to make that turn to look at that justice in the individual, we're going to have to make a new beginning, which is exactly what they do at the start of book 5. And I will close at this point, this lecture. The next lecture, the fourth of the 5 lectures, will look at the central books 5 to 7 of the Republic. Thank you very much.